Welcome to the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast, your go-to resource for navigating the complexities of divorce in Illinois. I am your host, Greer Howard, and I am here with our expert, Bobby Buchanan. Bobby, how you doing today?
Hey, Greer. Great to be here. I'm doing fantastic.
Well, our topic today is a doozy. So the financial considerations in divorce, Bobby. So today we're talking about a very crucial topic, and understanding your finances when you're going through a divorce is very important. So you want to assess your financial situation. You want to understand how you're divvying up assets. You're potentially talking about alimony, child support, and a whole lot of other things. So Bobby, why don't we just get started today by talking about assessing your financial situation? And if somebody is thinking about potentially getting a divorce, what is the first step in tackling your finances?
This is a great place to start, Greer. When you're thinking about divorce, you're going to think about, okay, I've been married maybe for 5, 10, 15 years, and there's all this property we've acquired, or maybe some debt you've acquired. You've progressed along your career, and your financial situation has probably changed significantly from when you first got together with your spouse. So the number one thing I always recommend is to do an inventory first and foremost. And this isn't something that most of us do. I know personally, I'm not the best with my own finances. I'm not someone who has like a balance sheet and knows all of the assets and all of the debts that I have, but it's a really good and really important exercise to do when you start a divorce, is to make a balance sheet.
And specifically, you have to get actual documents, right? I mean, that's pretty crucial as well, getting that documentation.
Yeah, getting documents is going to serve you in so many different ways. You're going to need them down the road, and it's going to be the starting place for your inventory. So as you go through and do an inventory of all your assets and all your liabilities, you're going to want to put things together like the deed to your home, bank statements, pay stubs, credit card statements, everything that really proves what you have and what you owe to other people.
Okay, so realistically, Bobby, that's a lot of work. So we just have to, you got to say that it is work to get all of that information together. Do you have any tips of keeping that information organized?
Yeah, staying organized is going to be really key to keeping the stress down in this process. Personally, I like to do things digitally, so I would probably make a folder system. You could use just something as simple and free like Google Drive, and get your documents in an electronic format. A lot of them already are in electronic format, so you don't need to do anything. Some of them you might have to scan. You don't need a scanner for that. You can just get a phone app and take pictures of your documents, but get them into an electronic format, start making folders. You have to make subfolders. Titling them in a way where you can understand what they are from the title is going to help you organize everything as well.
Okay, so after you sort of assess the financial situation, you gather those documents, it's really about then understanding the division of these assets. So, Bobby, why don't you tell us how Illinois specifically handles the division of assets when it comes to divorce?
Sure. So there are two key concepts that we have to understand how our assets are going to be divided. The first is marital versus non-marital property, and then the second one is equitable division of property.
So, can you explain a little bit more about what is marital versus non-marital property?
Yeah, so this is something you've probably never heard of before you dive into the divorce process, marital versus non-marital property. We can kind of pick up what it is from the words themselves, even though we don't say marital in everyday speech, but marital is property that's related to the marriage, and non-marital is property that's outside of the marriage. So really, what does that mean? Well, in Illinois, broadly, we can say that anything acquired during the marriage is marital property. So your paycheck is marital property. You get your paycheck, you put it into a savings account. Doesn't matter if that savings account just has your name on it. that property is marital because you earn that money during the marriage.
Oh, wow.
Non-marital.
Okay. Yeah, that's so interesting because when you say that, in some ways, I was thinking property like your family home, but it's more than that.
Yeah, it's more than that. It's really everything. So everything that you earn, that is property that you're acquiring. Now, if you spend it, of course, that's not property that exists, so we don't need to worry about it. But it's going to be everything you earn and your marital home. Now, non-marital property could be things that you acquire during the marriage, but usually it's stuff that you got before the marriage. So everything that you had before the marriage, if you keep it separate, generally speaking, it's going to be non-marital. Now, the exception to things that you acquire during the marriage being marital, the two most common exceptions are things that you inherit and gifts. So let's say that you have a parent that passes away or a family member that passes away, and they give you something in their will or a trust. As long as it has just given to you and as long as you keep it separate, that'll be non-marital property as well. And non-marital property is not split at all in the divorce process.
Okay. So, can you talk a little bit about equitable distribution and how that comes into play?
Sure. So we have marital property, right? And that's like a bucket of stuff. How it's divided is equitably. That's the equitable division piece that we're talking about. In through the divorce process, the court has to decide how that marital property is going to be divided. And it's not equitable division isn't necessarily 50-50 division. Now, I should say you don't need the court to decide this for you. And we talk a lot about don't have the court decide this for you. This is where you and your spouse can just agree on how you're going to divide things. You don't have to have the court do it for you, but the law provides a framework, a way of looking at things so that you know, okay, if negotiations break down, then I'm going to go to court. And what is the court going to do? They're going to divide this equitably.
And what would some of those factors look like? What is the court looking for?
Yeah. So if you take this to the judge because everything is broken down, you can't negotiate how you're going to divide your marital property, and you have to go to trial and have a judge divide it, the judge is going to look at a number of different factors to decide what is equitable. The biggest ones are going to be the length of the marriage, and the contributions of both parties, and the economic circumstances of both parties. So it's a lot. It's something that we call in the legal world the totality of the circumstances. It's very similar to that concept. The judge can look at a lot of different things to decide what is equitable.
So, could you maybe give a little more detail of how these factors are evaluated exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's imagine that we have a marriage that is 20 years and the spouses decide to get divorced, and one of them the entire 20 years has been the homemaker or the principal, the primary parent. They were maybe even got a master's degree or a PhD, or they were a lawyer when the marriage started, but they let that go because both of the parties decided, you know what, it's more important for you to raise the kids, and that's going to bring value to our family unit. And the other spouse continued on their career journey, and they were very successful, and they earned a lot of money, and that was put away in 401k, stocks, retirement accounts. They bought a house, they have equity in the house, and now they're trying to figure out what is a fair split. And maybe the spouse who's even the earner came into the marriage with $500,000 that they already had through inheritance or whatever else the case may be. The court's going to look at all that, and they might decide, you know, it's really not fair to leave the spouse who sacrificed everything financially to raise the kids with 50%. To really make this fair, it should be 70-30. And that's the most common scenario we see an uneven division. And it usually goes to the spouse who sacrificed financially in order to raise the family.
That's so interesting. So, what about the economic circumstances? How does that come into play?
So specifically, economic circumstances would be what we're talking about of like the wage, the earning ability of that parent that sacrificed everything. They're in a much different economic circumstance where they can't just go out into the workforce and be making six figures. They might have to spend 10 years gaining the experience, gaining the network of people and everything else that it takes to be professionally successful. And so their economic circumstance really kind of dictates that they need a little bit more, they deserve a little bit more in the split of the assets.
Yeah. So you've mentioned 50-50 or 70-30, a couple different splits. What would you say is the exception or maybe the rule? Or does it vary?
So it does vary, but 50-50 really is the rule. I just said a bunch of stuff about these factors and these different scenarios and maybe somebody getting 70 and somebody else getting 30. But as divorce attorneys, we come at it from the 50-50 lens. And that's because judges often say, listen, I'm going to start with 50-50 and I need to hear something really compelling to push me one way or the other. So as we're trying to figure out divorce with our spouse and hopefully doing it over the dinner table or doing it in mediation, 50-50 is usually the place we're going to start. Now, if you're doing that with your spouse right now and you're feeling like, hey, because of my economic circumstances, I don't think that this is fair and 50-50 doesn't feel right, then talk to a lawyer because it could be that you do have one of these exceptional, compelling cases where you could be getting 60-40 or 70-30.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit specifically about some commonly disputed assets, real estate, which we sort of touched on, but let's get a little bit deeper into that. And then also retirement accounts.
Yeah, those are the two big ones, the two most common ones that we need to figure out when we get divorced. So real estate is, in most divorces, marital property. And we got to remember, it doesn't matter whose name is on the title. Even if the other party's name is the only one on the title or it's only your name, if the house was acquired during the marriage, it's marital property. In certain circumstances, if it was acquired before the marriage, it's still marital property. So that's a big one that we're going to look at when we start that inventory and start looking at what's on the balance sheet. So how do we divide the house then? Well, there's a couple different options. The first one is the simplest. Simplest from a logistical standpoint. We sell the house and we split the proceeds. It's not so simple from an emotional standpoint. As we know, we can hold a lot of emotions and attachment to our houses, but that's one way we can deal with a house is we sell it and we split the proceeds. The other most common way is what's called a buyout. And that's where we figure out how much equity is in there. One side might have to do what's called a cash out refinance, where they can say to a bank, listen, there's $500,000 of equity in here. I want to pull out $250,000 of cash, refinance the mortgage, and now you have $250,000 that you give to the other spouse, and that's the way you split it.
Yeah. So what about retirement accounts? How does that work exactly?
Yeah, retirement accounts is the other big one. And there's two main types of retirement accounts. There's the 401k type. 403b is another type that's similar to 401k, but a 401k actually has a balance. So when we're looking at how to split it, we usually first have to determine what portion is marital and which portion is non-marital, because we probably earned some of it before the marriage. Once we do that and figure out how much is marital, then if we're splitting it 50-50, we just cut that in half. And the actual way that we get that money is we use a legal tool called a qualified domestic relations order. You don't need to worry about what that's called. Just know that you send it into Fidelity or whoever manages your 401k. They contact your spouse and say, okay, we're going to open a 401k for you too. And you can actually just transfer that money into the the other 401k. If it's a pension, which don't exist as much anymore, but that old school pension where there's not so much a balance, but it just accrues value. That again can be split by one of these qualified domestic relations orders. And there's a technical formula that we use to determine how much is marital and non-marital and how much your spouse gets. So there is a way to do it, and it's done quite frequently.
Yeah. Well, it sounds a little complicated, Bobby. And I can see why people want a professional in this scenario because my goodness, there's a lot to go through and to consider. And the next thing that I wanted to touch on was financial affidavits and the discovery process. So we learned about the dividing of property, and it might be nice to sort of talk a little bit about that process. So, what about the financial affidavits do you feel like is important for people to understand?
Yeah, so financial affidavits is a key part of the divorce process. It's closely related to that inventory that we talked about. A
Mhm.
financial affidavit is a sworn statement. It's a special form. It's 9 or 10 pages long where you are putting down every single thing that you have any interest in as far as assets or liabilities. You're putting down what your income is, what your expenses are. It's this very detailed document where you're telling the court and the other side what you have and what you owe.
Wow. Okay. So, do you have to have a financial affidavit? Because it does sound a little personal and private.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and it's a lot, and not every marriage has this level of transparency as far as finances go. Sometimes spouses have credit cards that the other side doesn't
Mhm.
even know about, or sometimes one side thinks that the taxes have been filed for the last 5 years and they never have, or maybe
Mm.
your spouse doesn't know about, I don't know, a car that you actually have that you've never talked about. So it can be really daunting to turn this over. Is it necessary? In 97% of cases it is. It's not necessary if you and your spouse agree that it's not necessary, but even in those cases, a judge can come in and say, hey, I'm not comfortable signing off on this divorce until I know that there's been financial transparency here.
Mm.
So I'm going to order you to do the financial affidavit. So we require all our clients to do it at least internally so that we can understand their exposure and potential issues in the case. In certain rare cases, we can avoid the whole exercise. But yeah, I mean, part of divorce is having to open things up a little bit more than maybe you had during the marriage.
So, what if you think that someone is not telling the truth on a financial affidavit? How can you potentially get that information?
Financial affidavits are just step one. And in most cases, step one is enough. That is the level of transparency that's needed. Your attorney might ask the other side, hey, can I get a bank statement to validate or corroborate this number that you're giving me? But in other cases, you might think that your spouse, and they might be just making things up or leaving property off of there or hiding it in some sort of way. If that's the case, then the next step is what's called discovery.
Mm.
And discovery is something that happens in all lawsuits, and it's a very powerful tool. It's one of the main reasons that people open up cases is because they want to use the tools of discovery. And the main tools of discovery are what's called requests to produce and interrogatories and subpoenas. So basically what they are is just formal requests to the other side saying, I want you to turn over all your bank statements for the last 3 years. I want you to turn over all your pay stubs for the last 3 years. It's usually a list of like 40 different documents, and it's quite a cumbersome overwhelming, expensive endeavor, but it can be key in discovering things that were left off of the financial affidavit. Another discovery tool, technically not discovery, but we don't want to get in the legal weeds here, but another tool is subpoenas. We've all heard subpoenas kind of through common knowledge, common understanding of the law. A subpoena is a formal request that you send to someone who's not in the lawsuit. So let's say that you do a request for production and say, I want you to turn over all your bank statements. They turn over some bank statements, and then you read through them and you see that there was a transfer to another bank. But you're going, they didn't turn over anything from Wells Fargo. Well, then you send out a subpoena to Wells Fargo and say, I want you to give me all bank statements for this person with this birthday and last four of their social. And Wells Fargo is legally required to turn over that information. So with using those tools, you can really go down the rabbit hole and find stuff out and nail them, for lack of a better phrase, with hard evidence that they lied on their financial affidavit.
Wow. So are you typically doing the subpoena and the discovery if you think someone is not being honest? I mean, it seems like that's an extra step you're taking because you think there's maybe someone's not being truthful. Is that correct? Or because that's a lot of work.
That is a lot of work, and you pretty much nailed it. You don't want to go down that road if you don't have to, because it does take a long time. It is expensive, and the other side is going to respond in kind. They're going to do the same thing back to you. It's just kind of normal litigation practice. Oh, you're going to make me do all this work with discovery. You're going to make me turn over the last 5 years of every financial document I've ever touched or created or been a part of. Then I'm going to do the same thing to you. So we try to avoid it in most cases. We try to just do it in a more friendly manner. And sometimes you just you're like, hey, can I get the last year of credit card statements for this? And if we get that friendly request from the other side in a case where we're the attorney, we're going to always tell our client, just turn it over. We don't need to make this a battle over documents. Once it becomes a battle over documents, the process probably goes from being 3 months long to at least 9 months. And you go from having a 4-figure divorce as far as attorney's fees to a healthy 5-figure divorce. It's very expensive, very long.
Yeah. And if you do find yourself heading towards the discovery process, how does someone potentially prepare for that?
You have to go back to that inventory that we started. Now, when you first start doing that inventory, you don't need to go as deep as the discovery process is going to take you. But I think the best way to prepare for it is to start to get organized with those documents, talk to your paralegal, that's going to be your attorney's assistant, about how they might recommend compiling all this and organizing it. You're going to be working closely with them. Try to manage your emotions in the process, because you're probably going to be having some thoughts about your spouse as you're spending late nights after work sifting through all this financial documentation. So you want to be able to process those emotions in a healthy way so that those don't get in the way of just getting through the process, because it is tough. It is tough.
Yeah. So we've talked about, dividing the property and, being able to share your financial information. And another kind of topic that can get a little contentious at times, has some potential for that, is alimony and child support. So why don't we start with alimony? How exactly does that work?
Sure. So alimony is, I think, a charged word, something that we all have some feelings about when we hear it. Alimony is also known as spousal support, also known as maintenance in Illinois, and it is usually the regular payments from one spouse to another. So if you're ordered to pay alimony, you could be ordered to pay anywhere from $1,000, or really it could be $500. There's no set amount on the bottom that it could be up to. There's no set amount on the top either. So it really could be, we hear about some of these celebrity divorces where one side is getting 20, 30, 40, $50,000 a month. It all depends on or not all, but the biggest thing is how much are the people making? What are the incomes involved? So there is a process in determining exactly what someone's going to pay in alimony.
So can you explain the factors that affect the court's decision concerning alimony?
Yeah, so there's two main factors the court's going to look at. The first one is the length of the marriage, and then the second one is the incomes of the parties. And there's an actual formula that the court uses that is codified in the law. And the first one, the length of the marriage, you just look at, okay, do you have a marriage of 5 years? You go to the law, and it says, okay, if you have a marriage of 5 years, then your alimony is going to be X number of months or X number of years long. Technically, they use what's called a factor. We don't need to dive into that, but just know that if your marriage is longer, your alimony award or how much alimony or how long you pay alimony is going to be longer. The key number, a lot of people think that, if you're not married for 10 years, then you can't give or get alimony. It has nothing to do with it. Really, alimony can start from just being married for a year. Now, if you run it through the calculator, you're only going to get alimony for like 2 months. So oftentimes it doesn't make sense to fight over that amount of alimony. But if you're married for 20 years or more than 20 years, alimony can be indefinite. It can literally go on forever. So it becomes a pretty big thing to fight over. And parties oftentimes, if they can't negotiate a resolution, will go to trial over the alimony issue, which is expensive and not needed. We oftentimes can come to a settlement, but it is a key sticking point in many cases.
So concerning alimony, length of the marriage is one factor, and then income is the other factor, right?
Exactly. So what we're going to do when we're trying to figure out potential alimony amounts is look at how much does the breadwinner make, and then how much does the party make that's going to be receiving the alimony. It's approximately, now don't quote me on this, but it's approximately 1/3 of the net income of the breadwinner minus 25% of the net income of the person who's going to receive the alimony, which is usually a nominal amount. So when you're thinking about alimony and how much you're going to have to pay, if you are the breadwinner, you can kind of bank on or start with 1/3 of your net income, which can feel like a lot, and it is. And it needs to be factored in, and there's ways to negotiate around it, and there's ways to offset it, but it is a significant part of the divorce process and splitting up assets and figuring out how the finances are going to be resolved.
Sure. And in addition to alimony, potentially if you have children, child support is also a factor as well. So how is child support calculated?
Yeah, child support, just like alimony, has a formula that we use and has guidelines that we use. Unlike alimony, which is a bit more discretionary, judges might not even award it at all in certain circumstances. Child support isn't that way. Child support is going to be awarded if one of the parties wants it to be awarded, unless there's some drastically compelling reason not to. But judges award child support all of the time. Now, the formula, there's again two major factors we got to look at: how many children are involved, and what is the income of the parties. And you plug those two things in to the calculator. It's called the income shares model. That's what Illinois uses. And it's going to spit out a number. It's based on, I'd give you the formula itself, but it's based on this massive table that was put together by economists. And frankly, no attorney nor judge memorizes it, nor do we need to. We go to the child support calculator, we put in the numbers, and it gives us the guideline child support amount.
And how are you able to ensure that the payments are fair and adequate?
It is a guideline. Like I said, economists put this table together. Our sage lawmakers approved it, and that is the child support amounts. Now, sometimes it doesn't feel fair. Sometimes you see that child support amount and you say, "Wait a minute, if I pay that amount of child support, I'm not going to be able to afford my rent or my lifestyle." Sometimes you look at the child support amount and say, "That's all I get." Do you know how much it
Mhm.
costs to raise a child? So you're not always going to be exactly happy with the child support amount, but we usually tell our clients, listen, this is one that's not worth fighting over. There might be some wiggle room. And if there are areas where we can negotiate it up or down, we will. But that is one where you might just have to adjust your lifestyle around the child support award rather than spend a lot of time figuring out how to litigate it up or down.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Bobby, this brings us to professional guidance because, wow, taking in all of this information and all of the factors, I just can't even imagine going through all these financial considerations and not having a professional. So, I mean, I just can imagine how challenging that must be. So, how important would you say that it is to have professional guidance through this process?
Yeah, this is complex. And I would imagine most people listening to this right now might feel a little bit overwhelmed. And it's overwhelming to learn anything new. It's especially overwhelming to learn something new where there's a lot of emotions involved. So having professional help, professional support is going to be key to getting through this process as efficiently as possible. And there's a
Yeah.
number of different professional, experts in the divorce space who can help you get through this.
So could you maybe explain some of those roles, some of those professionals that help people get through divorce?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one might be your financial advisor. If you already have one, great. If you don't have one, now might be a good time to look into getting one. That's going to be the expert who just knows numbers backwards and forwards, knows finances backwards and forwards, and is going to help you understand the implications of this divorce on your own assets, your potential retirement, et cetera, putting together budgets, running different scenarios that can maybe inform the other most important expert in this case, which is the divorce attorney. You can get divorced without a divorce attorney. There's paperwork. You can go to the courthouse. You can get the paperwork. You can fill it out. People do get divorced without divorce attorneys. The problem with doing that is that you might miss something really important that's going to cost you down the road or does cost you immediately. It's really hard to negotiate and navigate the divorce process, even when you get along perfectly with the other person that you're doing this with. But if you throw in any sort of element where they're not as cooperative as they need to be, or they're a little bit difficult, it makes it so much harder. So the divorce attorney, at a minimum, can be somewhat of an emotional buffer between the parties. And then the other expert that I would recommend people really look into as a possible way to get through this process quickly or as efficiently as possible is the mediator. Mediators can be so helpful. A lot of mediators are divorce attorneys themselves. Others aren't divorce attorneys. They've just been doing divorce mediation for a long time and understand the ins and outs. But a mediator is going to be somebody that you and your spouse go to, and they help you talk through, think through, negotiate through all the different things we've been talking about today. And they help take the emotion out of it and just come to a fair resolution or a negotiated resolution.
Well, it sounds like having all the professionals on your side can make a huge difference in the outcome in your divorce.
Absolutely. Professional guidance is key to getting through this process. It's hard to do it without it.
Yes. Okay. Well, Today, let's recap a few things that we've talked about. So, we talked about understanding and managing your financial considerations in divorce so that you can secure your future. We talked about assessing your financial situation, your asset division, financial affidavits, alimony, child support, and getting professional help. So, we covered a lot today, Bobby.
Yeah, absolutely. We hope that this financial consideration overview has given people some insight into that side of divorce. On the next episode, we're going to talk about the other big side of divorce, which is child custody and parenting plans. So, as always, if you're listening to this and you want us to talk about something in particular, if you're hearing this when we're publishing it, let us know or just give us feedback in general. We're always open to hearing that.
Yes, absolutely. Please comment, like, subscribe. We love to hear feedback because, we are here. The Illinois Divorce Guide podcast is here for you to answer your questions. And also, as a reminder, we are not providing legal advice, and this is for information purposes only. But it's been a great episode. So, Bobby, thanks so much for hanging out with me today.
Thanks for hanging out with me, Greer, and thanks everybody for listening to the podcast.
That's right. Well, to find out more, you can go to our YouTube channel, which is Illinois Divorce TV. You can go to Bobby's website, which is rbbfirm.com, or give him a call at 312-757-4833. And we will see you next week on the Illinois Divorce Guide podcast.